In the cutover country north of the St. Louis River, the cold does not arrive. It rises. It comes up through the ground before it presses down from the sky, seeping through dirt floors and pooling at ankles so that a person standing in a cabin feels winter climbing their body from below. The trees are stumps. The slash is rotting. The clearings smell of pine pitch and wet ash. In one of those clearings, a young woman crouches inside a one-room cabin, pressing her palm against the dirt floor. Her hand comes up dark with moisture. On the bed behind her, a wool cap and a folded knife that are not hers sit where she placed them and has not moved them since. The envelope held $11.40. Ragna Tveit counted it twice on the morning after they buried Elias, spreading the coins and creased notes across the same plank table where he had eaten his last breakfast 7 days before. She was 18 years old. She had been married 7 months. She was now the sole owner of a one-room log cabin 16 feet by 18 feet with a dirt floor, a cast-iron box stove with a cracked flue collar, and 1.5 cords of split birch stacked against the north wall under a canvas that had already begun to rot at the grommets. The cabin sat in a cutover clearing near the upper reach of the St. Louis River watershed, in the timber belt of northern Minnesota, where logging crews moved through the woods like a slow fire, cutting everything, leaving stumps and slash and the families of the men who fell. Elias Tveit had fallen. A white pine kicked back off the saw cradle on the 9th of October, 1884, and struck him across the chest before anyone could shout. The foreman said he was dead before the tree finished settling. The foreman said it was quick. Ragna did not find that comforting. The logging company sent his personal effects in a canvas sack, his wool cap, his lunch tin, a folding knife with a birch handle he had carved during their first month of marriage. His pay had been mostly advanced against supplies at the company store. The deduction sheet, written in a clerk's careful hand, showed charges for boots, axe handle, saw file, lamp oil, and a wool blanket Ragna had never seen. What remained after deductions was the $11.40 now spread across her table. She had flour. She had salt pork in a stoneware crock. She had dried beans in a sack that smelled of mouse. She had lard, a half bag of oats, some loose tea in a tin. If she rationed carefully, eating once a day, and stretching the pork into broth, she could feed herself for 5 weeks, maybe 6 if the oats held, and she could stomach plain porridge without sweetening. 5 weeks took her to late November. Winter in this country did not end until April. The Lutheran deacon who had helped carry the pine coffin to the cemetery ridge came by the next morning. He stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and told her that the Women's Aid Society could find her a room in Duluth if she wanted to leave. There was domestic work available. She was young and strong. She could start again somewhere warmer, somewhere with people, somewhere a woman alone would not freeze to death trying to prove up a quarter-section claim that had never produced anything but stumps and grief. Ragna thanked him. She said she would think about it. She did not think about it. The claim was the only thing she owned in the world that could not be spent, eaten, or burned. Elias had filed on it 8 months before the wedding. If she abandoned it, the improvements, the cabin, the half-cleared land, the well he had started reverted. She would leave with less than she had arrived with because she had arrived with a husband. The burial plot on the ridge was not transferable. If she left him in a stranger's ground. She did not say any of this to the deacon. She said she would think about it, and she closed the door, and she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms against her eyes until the pressure made colors bloom in the dark. 3 days after the burial, Nels Halverson came. He did not knock. He pushed the door open with one hand, the way men of his age and standing entered cabins in that country, and he stood inside the threshold and looked at everything with the slow, measuring gaze of a man who had survived 23 winters in northern Minnesota and buried 2 wives doing it. He was 58 years old, built like a stump, with hands so scarred from saw work that the knuckles had fused into a single ridge of white tissue. He had been Elias's nearest neighbor, 1.25 miles through the timber, and he had helped dig the grave because the ground was not yet frozen hard enough to require a fire. He looked at the stove. He looked at the woodpile through the gap where the door did not quite meet the frame. He looked at the dirt floor, which was not dirt in any clean sense, but a slurry of packed clay, wood ash, and moisture that turned slick when the stove ran and froze into ridges when it did not. He looked at the chinking between the lower logs, where the clay and moss mixture had shrunk away from the wood and left gaps wide enough to slide a knife blade through. Nels Halverson did not waste words. He pointed at the woodpile and said, "How much?" 1.5 cords, Ragna said. "Maybe closer to 1.25. Some of it is green." Nels shook his head. "You need 4 to get through, 5 to be safe. 6 if January runs cold and you're feeding that stove all night." "I know." "You have money for hauled wood." $11. He made a sound in his throat, not quite a laugh, closer to the sound a man makes when he sees a calculation resolve into 0. $11 buys you maybe half a cord of cut and split birch delivered, if someone will deliver it. Most men are cutting for themselves now. "I know." Nels walked to the wall where the chinking had pulled away and pressed his thumb into the gap. Cold air streamed past his hand. He could feel it from 2 feet away. "These lower courses need recalking. All of them. That is a full day's work, maybe 2, and you need fresh moss and clay, and the clay should be mixed with straw or hair, and you need to do it before the ground freezes too hard to dig clay." He paused. "You know how to caulk?" "Elias showed me once." "Once." Nels let the word sit. He crossed the room to the floor and pressed his boot into the surface. It gave slightly, like pressing into cold dough. Moisture welled up around the sole. "This floor is killing you. Every time you fire that stove, you're heating the air, and the air heats the walls and the roof and goes out through every crack and gap, and the floor just sits here pulling cold up from the ground. You might as well be standing on the river." Ragna said nothing. "What you need," Nels said, "is a plank floor, raised, air gap underneath. Pine boards, tongue and groove, nailed to sleepers. That stops the ground cold and gives you a surface that holds some warmth. But boards cost money. You would need," he calculated in his head, 16 by 18, call it 290 square feet. Rough-sawn pine boards from the mill at current prices. You're looking at $20 minimum, plus sleepers, plus nails, plus hauling. I have $11. "I know what you have." Nels pulled his thumb from the wall gap and wiped it on his coat. "I'm telling you what the cabin needs. It needs caulking, it needs wood, and it needs a floor. You can't afford any of that in the quantity that matters. What you can do is sell the claim to someone who can, take the money, and get yourself to Duluth before the first hard snow." "I am not selling the claim." Nels looked at her. He did not argue. He had buried 2 wives. He knew what it looked like when a person's mind was set on something that would likely kill them, and he knew that arguing with that look was like arguing with the river. "You don't survive a North Country winter by experimenting," he said. "You survive it by wood, cash, and kin. You have none of those in sufficient quantity." He left. The door did not close all the way behind him. Cold air crawled across the floor and pooled around Ragna's ankles like water. She spent the next 2 days recalking the lower wall courses with clay she dug from the riverbank and moss. She pulled from deadfall logs in the timber. The work was brutal and slow. The clay was heavy, cold, and wet. It clung to her hands and turned her fingers into stiff white clubs by mid-afternoon. The moss had to be sorted for length and packed tight, then plastered over with the clay mixture, and every time she thought she had sealed a gap, she would go inside and hold a candle near the wall and watch the flame bend toward some new fissure she had missed. By the end of the 2nd day, she had sealed the lower courses on 3 walls. Her hands were cracked across both palms. Her back ached from stooping. She had used most of the accessible clay within carrying distance, and the floor was worse than before because her boots had churned the surface into a muddy track that would freeze overnight into sharp ridges and then thaw again when she lit the morning fire, creating a cycle of wet and hard that made every step uncertain. She stood in the middle of the cabin at dusk and felt the cold rising through the soles of her boots, not from the walls, not from the door, from below. The ground itself was a reservoir of cold, and every degree of heat the stove produced had to fight that cold before it could warm the air she breathed. That night, after she banked the fire and climbed into the bed Elias had built against the east wall, she lay awake and listened to the stove tick as it cooled. Within an hour, the cabin temperature had dropped enough that she could see her breath. Within 2 hours, the moisture on the floor near the door had begun to freeze. She pulled the blankets tighter and pressed her face into the pillow and thought about Nels Halverson's voice saying the word once. The next morning, she cooked oat porridge on the stove and ate it standing because the chair was too cold to sit on. When she set the iron pot on the flat stone that served as a trivet beside the stove, a piece of dark rock Elias had dragged up from the riverbank to keep the hot kettle from scorching the dirt, she noticed something. The stone was warm, not just warm from the pot. The stone had been sitting beside the stove all night, absorbing heat from the firebox through its iron wall, and even now, hours after the fire had burned low, the stone held warmth that the dirt floor 6 inches away had already surrendered. Ragna crouched and pressed her palm flat against the stone. Warm. She moved her hand 6 inches to the left and pressed it against the dirt. Cold. Wet. She moved back to the stone. Warm. Dry. She held her hand there and felt the heat bleeding up through her skin, steady and slow, like the stone was giving back something it had borrowed during the night. She stayed crouched for a long time. A memory surfaced, not a full scene, more like a sensation with a voice attached. Her father, back in the valley settlement in Norway, kneeling beside the bake oven in the summer kitchen. He had laid flat stone around the oven base, dark slabs that he had split from a ledge above the farm. She remembered the dusty mineral smell when 2 pieces clicked together. She remembered him pressing his palm against the stone in the evening, after the baking was done, and the oven had cooled, and saying that wood heat disappears fast, but stone remembers. Stone remembers. She had been 9 years old. She had not understood what he meant. She had felt the warm stone under her bare feet and thought it was a kind of magic, the way the floor stayed pleasant long after the fire was out. It was not magic. It was something else. Something about the weight and density of the rock, the way it drank heat slowly and gave it back slowly, holding the warmth inside its body the way a lake holds summer warmth into October. Ragna looked at the flat stone beside her stove, and then looked at the 16 by 18-foot expanse of cold, wet dirt that surrounded it. She thought about what Nels had said. She needed a floor. A plank floor cost $20. She had 11. But planks were not the only flat surface in the world. The St. Louis River cut through the country in a series of bends and narrows, and along its banks, exposed by centuries of water and frost, lay ledges of dark stone that split into flat layers. Ragna had seen them every time she walked to the river for water. She had walked on them. She had sat on them in September when the sun warmed them, and the stone held the warmth through the evening. Slate, dark, dense, heavy, and flat enough in places to stack like pages in a book. She went to the river that afternoon and stood on the bank and looked at the exposed ledge. Slabs of varying thickness, some as thin as her thumb, others as thick as her fist, lay in tilted layers where the water had undercut the bank. Many had already broken free and tumbled into the shallows. Others could be levered loose with a pry bar or the back of an axe head. She picked up a piece the size of a dinner plate and held it. Heavy, dense, cold from the river air, but somehow different from the cold of dirt. A clean cold, a solid cold, the kind of cold that implied the opposite. A stone this dense, placed near a hot stove, would absorb heat the same way the trivet beside her firebox did. And if she covered the entire floor, every square foot of wet, cold dirt. With flat-fitted stone, the floor itself would become a reservoir, not of cold, of whatever the stove poured into it. The stove produced heat in bursts. She fired it hard for cooking, hard again for evening warmth, and then banked it for the night. Each burst heated the air, and the air escaped through every crack and gap. But if the floor was dense stone instead of loose dirt, some of that heat would soak downward into the slabs instead of only escaping upward. And when the fire burned low, the stone would bleed the heat back, not forever, but longer than dirt, longer than air. Long enough, maybe, to stretch her wood through the night without waking every 2 hours to feed the stove. The logic was simple. The labor was not. She needed to strip the existing dirt floor down to a stable base. She needed to level that base with sand or compacted ash. She needed to haul hundreds of pounds of flat stone from the riverbank, a quarter-mile each way, uphill on the return, by hand, because she did not own a horse or a mule. She needed to fit the slabs tight, with minimal gaps, so the surface would be stable and continuous. She needed to do all of this before the ground froze so hard that digging and hauling became impossible. It was the 23rd of October. In this country, hard freeze could come any day after the first week of November. She had, at most, 3 weeks of workable ground, maybe less if an early storm pushed through. 3 weeks to lay 290 square feet of stone by hand. Marta Bell came by on the afternoon Ragna began digging out the old floor. Marta was 41, the wife of the road overseer, mother of 4 children under 12, and the closest thing Ragna had to a friend in the settlement. She was not cruel. She was not unkind. She was the kind of woman who survived by calculating the distance between effort and result, and never wasting either. She stood in the doorway and watched Ragna shoveling wet dirt into a bucket. The cabin smelled of clay and damp and wood smoke. The stove was cold because Ragna had moved it to one side on a temporary stone pad to access the floor beneath. "What are you doing?" Marta said. It was not a question. It was the sound a person makes when they already know the answer and wish they did not. "Laying a stone floor." "With what stone?" "River slate, from the ledge below the bend." Marta stepped inside and looked at the exposed ground. "You're digging out the floor of your cabin in late October?" "Yes." "To replace it with river rock." "Flat stone, slate, it holds heat." Marta was quiet for a moment. She looked at the trivet beside the stove, the dark slab that Ragna had been studying for 2 days. Then she looked back at the raw, wet ground. "Ragna, stone is cold. Everyone knows that. You walk into a stone church in winter and your feet go numb. Stone does not hold heat. Stone is what heat leaves." "A stone church has stone walls exposed to outside air," Ragna said. "I am talking about stone inside a closed room near a stove. The stone beside my stove is warm right now. Feel it." Marta did not move to feel it. "Even if you are right, and I am not saying you are talking about hauling hundreds of pounds of rock uphill by yourself in 3 weeks. You are 18 years old and you weigh 120 pounds. The stone will weigh more than you do. Every trip. I know. And if it does not work, if you lay all that stone and the floor is colder than before, you will have spent the last warm weeks doing the wrong labor. You will not have those weeks back. The ground will be frozen. The river will be frozen. And you will be exhausted and alone in a cabin with a stone floor that pulls heat instead of holding it. It will not pull heat. Dense material absorbs heat from a nearby source and releases it slowly. That is how bake ovens work. That is how hearths work. The trivet works. I need the whole floor to work." Marta looked at her. The look held something between pity and respect, and it was impossible to tell which one was winning. "Your hands are already bleeding," she said. Ragna looked at her palms, cracked across both, with raw pink lines where the shovel handle had ground against the skin. She had not noticed. You should at least wrap them, Marta said. Cloth strips, lard on the inside. If those cracks go deep and fester, you will not be able to grip anything by November. She left without offering to help. She did not say it would fail. She did not say it would succeed. She said Ragna's hands were bleeding, and she was right. The news that Ragna Tveit was tearing up her cabin floor and replacing it with river rock reached Silas Broden's store by the following afternoon. Silas ran the only general store within 8 miles. He sold provisions, hardware, lamp oil, and hauled firewood at winter prices that rose with the temperature's fall. He also extended credit, generous credit, with terms that included liens on improvements, future crop shares, and in several documented cases, partial claim rights. Widows and single women were his most reliable winter customers. They had no choice and no leverage, and their desperation made his margins. He appeared at Ragna's cabin on a cold Tuesday morning, riding a black mare that was too fine for the road and wearing a coat that was too clean for the country. He did not dismount. He sat in the saddle and looked down at the hand sledge Ragna had rigged from 2 birch poles and a piece of canvas, loaded with 4 slabs of dark slate, each one 30 pounds or more. I hear you're building yourself a stone floor, Silas said. Ragna set down the drag rope and straightened her back. She did not answer. A stone floor. He said it the way a man says something he wants the listener to hear is absurd. In a 16 by 18 foot cabin with 1.5 cords of wood and no husband. The wood is closer to 1 1/4 now, Ragna said. I've been heating while I work. Silas smiled. It was not a kind smile. I can have 2 cords of split birch delivered to your door by Friday. Good dry wood, enough to get you to December at least. All you need to do is sign a winter credit agreement, standard terms. What are the standard terms? You pay back the value of the wood plus 15% by April 1st. If you cannot pay, the balance converts to a lien on your improvements. My improvements are the cabin. That's correct. So if I cannot pay, you take the cabin. Silas adjusted his reins. The terms are the same for everyone. I do not make the winter. I just help people get through it. No, Ragna said. No to the terms or no to the wood? Both. Silas looked at the hand sledge loaded with slate. He looked at the cabin behind her, where the door stood open and the interior was visible, raw ground, displaced dirt in buckets, the stove sitting off-center on its temporary pad. Mrs. Tveit, your husband is dead. You have no family within 200 miles. You have no money, no wood, and no floor. And now you are hauling river rock into your house instead of doing something useful. He gathered his reins. When a woman starts hauling river rock in November, grief has taken her mind. He turned the mare and rode back down the track toward the main road. Ragna stood beside the loaded sledge until the sound of hooves faded. Then she picked up the drag rope and leaned into the weight and hauled the stone the remaining 100 yards to her door. If you have ever been told your work was madness by someone who could not see what you were building, tell us about it in the comments. We want to hear your story. The first slab went down that afternoon. She had spent the morning leveling a section of the exposed ground near the stove, with a mixture of coarse sand from the riverbank and wood ash from the stove. Aslak Moen. She did not know his name yet, had not arrived to teach her the proper method, so she worked by instinct and error, tamping the mixture with the flat of the shovel and testing the level with a straight birch stick laid across the surface. The slab was roughly 2 feet by 1.5 feet, 3/4 of an inch thick, dark as wet charcoal. She lowered it onto the prepared bed and pressed. It rocked. She lifted it, found the high point in the sand beneath, scraped it level, and set the slab again. It rocked less, but still wobbled when she shifted her weight to one corner. She lifted it a third time, scraped, tested, set it down. This time, it sat flat. She stood on it with both feet and shifted her weight from side to side. No wobble, no rock. The slab sat flush against the sand bed, and when she crouched and pressed her palm to its surface, the stone was cool but dry. Not the wet, sucking cold of the dirt. A clean, solid cold that she knew from her father's floor, the kind that would change character when the stove ran. One slab down. She needed roughly 200 to cover the floor, depending on size and fit. 200 slabs, quarter-mile each way to the river. 30 pounds minimum per slab, some closer to 50. No horse, no help. 3 weeks, maybe less. She went back to the river. The sun was already angling low when she reached the ledge. The exposed slate lay in tilted layers, some cracked by frost into usable pieces, others still locked in the bedrock. She selected 3 slabs by tapping them with the back of the axe head and listening to the sound. A clear ring meant solid stone. A dull thud meant hidden fractures. She had learned this from watching Elias test timber for rot, tapping the trunk and listening for the hollow sound that meant the heart was gone. Stone and wood answered differently, but the principle was the same. Sound told you what the surface hid. She loaded the 3 slabs onto the sledge, lashed them with rope, and began the uphill drag. The load caught on every root and stone in the track. Twice the sledge tipped, and she had to restack. By the time she reached the cabin, the light was gone, and her arms were shaking so badly she could not untie the rope knots. She used her teeth. That night she fired the stove and sat on the single-laid slab with her back against the warm iron. The slab beneath her absorbed the heat from the firebox, and by the time she finished her bowl of bean broth, the stone was warm through her wool skirt. She moved her feet from the slab to the dirt beside it. The difference was immediate and stark. Stone, warm, dry, solid. Dirt, cold, damp, yielding. 200 more trips, 200 more slabs. And the river was already beginning to skim with ice at the edges, a thin crystal crust that broke under her boots each morning but reformed each night, thicker than before. The cold was not coming. The cold was here. It was simply waiting for her to slow down. By the end of the first week, Ragna had cleared and leveled the quarter of the floor nearest the stove and laid 41 slabs in a rough rectangle extending 4 feet from the firebox on 3 sides. Her hands had split along every crease. The skin between her thumb and forefinger was raw pink where the drag rope wore through her wool mittens, and the mittens themselves were shredding at the palms. She wrapped her hands in strips of flour sack each morning, smeared with lard from the diminishing crock, and by noon the wrappings were black with grit and clay and had to be peeled off and rinsed in river water so cold it made her fingers lock into claws. The work had a rhythm now, brutal but measurable. She woke before light. She fired the stove just long enough to cook porridge and warm the cabin to a temperature where her joints would move. She ate standing. She dragged the hand sledge to the river in the blue half-dark, loaded 3 or 4 slabs, depending on thickness, and hauled them uphill to the cabin. She leveled a section of ground with sand and ash. She set stones, testing each one for wobble, lifting and resetting until it sat flat. She repeated this until the light failed or her back seized, whichever came first. Most days it was her back. The 41 slabs covered roughly 60 square feet. She needed 290. At the current pace, she would finish in 5 more weeks. She did not have 5 more weeks. The river ice was thickening daily. Each morning, the crust reached farther from the banks, and the slabs she needed were increasingly locked under ice or buried beneath the first dusting of snow that had begun to collect in the shade of the ledge. On the 9th day, she broke through a thin shelf of bank ice while levering a slab free and plunged her left leg into the river to the knee. The water was so cold it felt like fire. She dragged herself out and stood on the bank shaking, her boot full of water, her woolen stocking already stiffening in the air. She had to walk a quarter-mile back to the cabin in a boot that squelched and froze alternately with every step. By the time she reached the door, the wool had bonded to her skin with a crust of ice. She sat beside the stove and peeled the stocking free and looked at her foot, which was white and numb from the toes to the arch. She heated water in the kettle and soaked the foot until feeling returned, which took 20 minutes and hurt worse than the cold itself. Then she wrung out the stocking, draped it over the stovepipe, and went back to laying stone in her cabin, with one bare foot and one booted foot, because the stocking would not be dry until morning, and she could not afford to lose the remaining daylight. Aslak Moen arrived on the 11th day, and he arrived because of sound. He was 63 years old, a widower, who lived in a tight cabin 4 miles downstream, near the remnants of a Norwegian settlement that had half emptied after the grasshopper years. He had worked as a quarry hand in Norway before emigrating, and as a sometime mason after arriving, laying stone foundations and chimney bases for settlers who could afford skilled labor. Most could not. He supplemented with trapping and odd carpentry and a small garden that produced enough potatoes and turnips to see him through winter if the deer did not raid it. He had been walking the river path checking his trap line when he heard tapping. Not axe work. That sound carried differently. A deep splitting crack that traveled through the timber. This was lighter, rhythmic. A flat, ringing tap followed by a pause. Then another tap. He followed the sound to the ledge below the bend and found a young woman crouched on the exposed slate, striking the surface of each slab with the back of an axe head and cocking her head to listen before moving to the next. Aslak stopped walking and watched. She was selecting stone by sound. She was rejecting the slabs that thudded, cracked internally, prone to splitting under weight, and setting aside the ones that rang clear. She was not doing this randomly. She was working the ledge in a systematic grid, testing each exposed piece, marking the good ones by scratching an X with a nail. And she was choosing for flatness and thickness, not just size. The slabs she marked were uniformly dense and lay in the ledge's natural plane, the kind that would sit flush against a prepared bed without rocking. Aslak had not seen competent stone selection in 10 years. He had not expected to see it performed by a girl who looked barely old enough to be married, crouched on a frozen riverbank with bleeding hands and one boot darker than the other from recent soaking. He walked closer. She heard him and turned, gripping the axe head the way a person grips a weapon when they are alone and a stranger is approaching. "You are choosing for contact," Aslak said. His English was heavy with Norwegian inflection, the consonants clipped and the vowels drawn long. Not for beauty, for how the bottom sits. Ragna did not lower the axe head. "I need them to lay flat, against the bed. Tight." "What bed?" "Sand and ash. Tempt." Aslak's expression changed. It was a small change, a shift in the set of his mouth, a narrowing of his eyes that was not suspicion but recognition. He had seen 100 people pick up stone for 100 reasons, and most of them chose the way children chose, the biggest, the prettiest, the most impressive. This woman was choosing the way a mason chose, by the underside, not the top. "Who taught you to tap test?" he said. "No one. My husband used to test timber for rot by tapping. Hollow means bad. I tried it on stone. It works differently, but the clear ring means solid." Aslak nodded slowly. He sat down on a boulder at the edge of the ledge, which, in the language of a man who had spent 63 years conserving movement, meant he was not leaving soon. "What are you building?" he said. "A floor." "How big?" 16 by 18. He looked at the stack of marked slabs. He looked at her hands. He looked at the hand sledge leaning against a birch trunk with its rope coiled on top. You're doing this alone, he said. Yes. How much have you laid? 60 square feet, maybe 65. And the rest? I have 2 weeks, maybe less. Aslak was quiet for a long time. The river moved past them, dark and heavy with the cold that was settling into the country. Ice reached from both banks in thin, translucent shelves that would meet in the center within days. Your bed is wrong, he said. Ragna's shoulders tightened. What do you mean? Sand and ash tamped flat is better than dirt, but you are tamping it level by eye, and your eye is not good enough. You need a straight edge, a planed board, or a split cedar rail laid across the bed and checked in 2 directions. Every stone that bridges on a hump instead of sitting flat on its whole underside is a stone that will rock, crack, and lose contact, and contact is what you need. The heat does not jump across air gaps. It travels through what touches. He stood up from the boulder, walked to her stack of marked slabs, and picked one up. He turned it over and ran his thumb along the underside. This one is good. Flat on the bottom, clean grain, no hidden ridge. This one... He picked up another and showed her a slight convexity along the center line. This one bridges. It will sit on 2 points and wobble. Either reject it or dress the belly with a hammer and chisel. I do not have a chisel. I have a chisel. He set the slab down and looked at her, and in that look was something she had not seen since Elias died. Not pity, not charity, not the calculation of what she could be sold. Recognition. He was seeing a person who was doing a hard thing the right way for the right reasons, and who was failing only in the places where experience would have corrected instinct. I will come tomorrow, Aslak said. Bring the chisel. Show you how to dress a belly and set a proper bed. After that, you decide if you want help or instruction. Instruction, Ragna said. I want to know how to do it right. Aslak nodded as if she had passed a test he had not announced. He walked back along the river path toward his trap line, and Ragna stood on the ledge with the axe head in one hand and the cold crawling up through her boots, and for the first time in 11 days, the weight on her chest shifted from dread to something that was not yet hope, but was at least the possibility of competence. Aslak came the next morning carrying a canvas roll that held a mason's cold chisel, a short-handled hammer, and a planed cedar rail 4 feet long. He did not greet her. He walked into the cabin, crouched beside the laid section of floor, and placed the cedar rail across the surface. The rail rocked. He moved it to another angle. It rocked again. 3 of these are bridging, he said. They feel solid when you stand on them because your weight pushes them down, but lift your foot and they shift. That shift means air beneath. Air beneath means the heat goes into the stone and stops. It does not reach the bed. It does not spread. He lifted one slab, and Ragna saw the problem immediately. A ridge of compacted sand beneath the center had created a fulcrum. The stone sat on the ridge and teetered. She had tamped the bed by shovel, working by feel, and her feel had been wrong by a 1/4 inch. Reset it, Aslak said. He did not do it for her. He handed her the cedar rail and watched while she scraped the ridge down, retamped with the flat of the shovel, checked with the rail in 2 directions, and set the slab again. This time it sat dead flat. No rock, no wobble, full contact across the entire underside. Good, Aslak said. It was the first word of approval she had received from anyone in 18 days, and it landed in her chest like a coal. Over the next 3 days, Aslak appeared each morning and stayed until noon. He did not lay stone for her. He taught while she worked. He showed her 3 things that changed everything. First, bed preparation. The sand and ash mixture needed to be screened for pebbles and lumps that created hidden high points. He showed her how to sift the mixture through a piece of burlap stretched between two sticks, catching the debris that would have become invisible fulcrums beneath every slab. The screen bed tamped smoother, sat flatter, and held the slabs without creep. Second, joint stagger and perimeter gap. She had been laying slabs in rough rows, edge to edge, which created long, continuous seams that could shift under weight. Aslak showed her to stagger the joints the way a mason staggers brickwork, so that no seam ran more than 2 feet without being interrupted by a crossing slab. He also showed her to leave a finger-width gap at the walls, because the logs would shift with moisture and temperature, and a floor locked tight against the walls would crack the first time the cabin breathed. Third, the relationship between thickness and placement. Near the stove, where heat was most intense and most valuable, she needed the thickest slabs, 1 to 1.25 inches, because thicker stone absorbed more heat and held it longer. At the perimeter farther from the stove, thinner slabs sufficed because the heat reaching them would be less intense. This meant sorting her entire stone supply by thickness before laying, which cost half a day, but saved her from discovering the wrong slab in the wrong position after it was already bedded. Each lesson arrived through action. Aslak did not lecture. He placed his hands on the stone and showed her what right felt like by making her feel what wrong felt like first. He let her make mistakes and then corrected them with the minimum number of words required. When she asked why, he answered. When she did not ask, he was silent. The silence was not cold. It was the silence of a man who respected the concentration of another person's hands. By the end of the second week, the central walking zone was complete, roughly 130 square feet of fitted slate extending from the stove area to within 3 feet of the walls on all sides. The perimeter and wall edge work remained, and that was the hardest section because the logs were irregular and every wall slab had to be cut or selected to fit the curve and jut of the timber. Progress was measurable. The cabin was transforming. Where there had been wet, uncertain dirt, there was now a dark, solid surface that clicked under boot heels and held its shape regardless of whether the stove was hot or cold. The dampness that had risen from the ground was blocked by the stone layer and the compacted bed beneath. The air near the floor smelled different, less of mud and rot, more of mineral and wood smoke. But the woodpile had shrunk. Ragna had been firing the stove daily for warmth and cooking, and the 1 1/4 cords had dwindled to what she estimated was 3/4 of a cord. At the rate she was burning, the wood would last 4 more weeks. Winter would last 5 months. Nels Halverson returned on a gray afternoon when the sky looked like the inside of a lead pot. He stood in the doorway and looked at the floor the same way he had looked at everything the first time, slowly, measuring, assigning numbers to what he saw. "You have laid a stone floor," he said. "Most of it. The edges are not done." He stepped onto the slate and walked across the room. His boots rang against the surface. He crouched and touched the stone near the stove. Warm. He touched the stone near the wall, cool but dry. "The stove heats the stone," he said. "The stone holds it." "That is the idea." "For how long?" "I do not know yet. Longer than dirt. The stone beside the stove was still warm at midnight last night, 6 hours after I banked the fire." Nels stood up. He did not say it was clever. He did not say it would work. He looked at the woodpile visible through the open door and did the same calculation he had done the first time. "You still do not have enough wood," he said. "This floor may stretch what you have, or it may not. But even if it gives you an extra hour of warmth per firing, you are still short by half. This buys time. It does not buy winter." "I know." "Do you?" "I know I am short. I know the floor alone may not be enough. but it is what I can do with what I have. Wood costs money I do not have. The stone costs nothing but labor, and labor is the only currency I own. Nels looked at her for a long time. Something in his expression shifted, not to belief, but away from the certainty of dismissal. He had expected to find her defeated or gone. He had found her standing on a floor she had laid with her own hands, doing the math out loud, aware of the gap and working to close it. You need to finish the edges before hard freeze, he said, and you need to recalk the sill again. The chinking you did last month has already cracked in 2 places on the north wall. I know. Stop saying you know. Start doing it. He left. But he left differently than before. The first time, he had walked out like a man leaving a lost cause. This time, he walked out like a man leaving a problem he had not yet solved for himself. The 3rd week was the worst. Snow came in earnest on the 4th of November. Not a dusting, but a real fall, 3 inches by morning, then 6 by the next morning, wet and heavy, collapsing the slash piles in the cutover and turning the track to the river into a chute of mud and ice. The temperature dropped below freezing during the day and into the low single digits at night. The river ice was now solid enough to walk on at the edges, which meant the slate ledge was buried under snow, and the remaining exposed slabs were locked in a frozen grip that required the peavy handle and brute force to break free. Ragna's body was failing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small damages that compounded daily. Her back spasmed when she bent to lift slabs. Her fingers were so swollen she could not make a fist in the mornings until she soaked them in warm water. Her left knee, wrenched during the river plunge, ached with every step uphill. She was eating once a day, sometimes twice, but the portions were smaller because the food supply was dwindling faster than she had calculated. The beans were gone. The salt pork was half gone. The flour lasted because she mixed it thin, but thin porridge fed the body the way thin wood fed the stove, just enough to keep functioning, not enough to keep warm. One morning she woke and could not stand. Her back had seized in the night, locking the muscles along her spine into a rigid band that screamed when she tried to straighten. She lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and counted her breaths and tried to will the muscle to release. It took an hour. By the time she stood, the morning was half gone, and the light through the window was the flat gray of a day that would end early. She laid 4 slabs that day instead of the usual 12. Aslak came less frequently now, twice a week instead of daily. He was trapping, and the trap line demanded early mornings and long walks. But when he came, he worked alongside her, not doing her labor, but showing her how to do it more efficiently. He taught her to stockpile slabs outside the door during the good weather so she could lay them in bad weather without making the river trip. He taught her to warm the bed sand inside the cabin overnight so it would tamp properly instead of freezing into lumps. He taught her to use the stove's waste heat by placing slabs she intended to lay on the floor near the firebox for an hour before setting them, so the thermal shock of cold stone against warm bed would not crack the sand surface. On the 17th of November, the stove leg punched through a poorly bedded slab near the east wall. The crack was loud, a sharp, flat snap that sounded like a branch breaking, and the stove lurched 2 inches sideways, pulling the stovepipe joint loose and sending a plume of smoke into the cabin. Ragna scrambled to push the stove back while hot iron scorched through her flour sack hand wraps. She burned both palms. She sealed the pipe joint with a twist of wet rag that would hold for hours, not days. And then she had to pull the cracked slab, relevel the bed, and set a replacement, all while the cabin filled with the acrid smell of scorched cloth and her own skin. She did not cry. She had not cried since the burial. She suspected that if she started, the crying would consume the energy she needed for the next slab, and the next slab was more important than tears. 2 days later, Ragna returned from the river to find a burlap sack leaning against her door. Inside, coarse sand, fine sifted ash, and a note in a hand she did not recognize. The note said nothing about stone or floors. It said, "From the road crew pit, no one will miss it." Marta Bell did not come to the door. She did not explain. She did not admit that she had been thinking about the trivet beside the stove, or the way Ragna had said dense material absorbs heat, or the fact that Ragna's hands were bleeding and she was still laying stone in the snow. Marta simply left what was needed and walked away. It was the first act of material support Ragna had received from anyone except Aslak, and it arrived without a word, without a debt, and without the expectation of repayment. Ragna used every grain of it. The sand leveled the remaining perimeter beds. The ash filled the fine gaps between wall-edge slabs, where the irregular logs created spaces too narrow for stone. By the 21st of November, the floor was complete. 214 slabs, 16 by 18 feet. Every piece fitted, leveled, and seated against a screened sand and ash bed, tested with a cedar rail in 2 directions, with joints staggered and a finger gap at every wall. The thickest slabs, 1.25 inches, surrounded the stove. The thinnest, 1/2 inch, ran along the far walls. The surface was dark, almost black in the lamplight, and when Ragna stood in the center of the room and looked down, the floor looked like something that had always been there, like the cabin had finally become a house. She fired the stove hard that evening. Birch logs, dry, stacked tight in the firebox until the iron glowed dull red along the seams. She cooked beans and salt pork in the last of the good broth, and ate sitting on the floor beside the stove with her back against the warm iron and her palms pressed flat against the slate. The stone drank the heat. She could feel it happening, a slow, deep warming that started at the surface and moved inward, spreading outward from the stove zone toward the center of the room. By the time she finished eating, the floor within 3 feet of the stove was warm enough to sit on comfortably. By the time she cleaned the pot and banked the fire, the warmth had reached 5 feet from the stove on all sides. She marked the time on the wall with charcoal, the way Aslak had taught her. Fire banked at 7. She checked the floor at 9. Warm near the stove, cool but not cold at the center. She checked at 11. Still warm near the stove. The center had cooled but remained above the air temperature. She checked at 1 in the morning. The stove-side slabs had given up most of their heat, but still held a residual warmth that the air did not. 4 hours after banking the fire, the floor beside the stove was warmer than the air in the room. It was not proof. Not yet. Nels was right about that. Surviving a warm evening was not the same as surviving January. But the data was there, scratched in charcoal on the log wall. Times and rough temperatures judged by touch, recording a pattern that matched exactly what she had hoped. The stone remembered. December came with the weight of iron. The days shrank to 7 hours of gray light. The temperature dropped below 0 and stayed there, rising above freezing only twice in the first 2 weeks. Snow buried the track to the main road. The river froze solid from bank to bank. The trees cracked in the night with sounds like gunshots as the sap froze and split the wood. Ragna fell into a rhythm of conservation. She fired the stove twice a day, once in the morning for cooking and cabin warming, once in the evening for the overnight charge. Between firings, she let the stove go cold and relied on the floor. The slate held warmth for 3 to 4 hours after each hard firing, radiating a low, steady heat that kept the cabin above the threshold where breath froze and water turned solid. She supplemented with the blankets on the bed and a second wool layer she had sewn from Elias's old coat. The woodpile shrank, but it shrank more slowly than she had feared. The twice daily firing instead of the continuous overnight burn she would have needed with a bare dirt floor was stretching her supply. She estimated she had enough wood to last through the end of January if the cold did not deepen. If it deepened, she did not want to calculate. Nels stopped by in mid-December and said nothing about the floor. He looked at the woodpile. He looked at the sky. He said January would be bad. He said every old sign pointed to a hard one: the thickness of animal fur, the depth of the early snow, the timing of the river freeze. He said he had 6 cords stacked and was still worried. "You have less than a cord left," he said. "I know." "Stop saying that." "I am aware of what I have. The floor is buying me time. Each firing lasts longer. The overnight is survivable without continuous feed." "Survivable is not the same as safe?" She did not argue. Survivable was the only word she had access to. The storm announced itself 3 days before it arrived. The wind shifted to the northwest on the morning of the 7th of January. By noon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, dark purple along the horizon, greenish gray overhead, the kind of sky that made animals huddle and men check their woodpiles twice. The temperature, which had been hovering near 10 below zero, began to fall in a steady, relentless slide that Ragna could track by the behavior of the cabin itself. The chinking groaned as the logs contracted. The frost line on the inside of the window glass climbed higher by the hour, and the water bucket near the door froze solid by mid-afternoon, despite being 6 feet from the stove. By sunset, the temperature was 30 below. The wind was building from the northwest, driving fine, crystalline snow that did not fall so much as move horizontally through the air, finding every crack and gap in every structure it passed. Ragna sealed the door with wool rags and the flour paste she had prepared for exactly this purpose. She sealed the window with a doubled flour sack tacked to the frame. She checked the chinking on all 4 walls and stuffed fresh moss into 3 gaps she found on the north side, where the cold was pushing through like water through a cracked dam. She fired the stove at 4 in the afternoon. Not a maintenance fire, a charging fire. She loaded the firebox with the best dry birch she had, straight-grained, seasoned, dense enough to burn hot and long. She fed it for 2 hours, stoking until the iron sides of the stove glowed dull orange and the air in the cabin climbed to what felt like 70 degrees, maybe higher. Sweat ran down her back. She opened her coat and let the heat soak into her body and her clothes and the walls and the floor. The floor. The slate was drinking it. She could feel the heat moving into the stone through the soles of her boots, a steady downward pull that meant the surface was absorbing energy from the superheated air above. The slabs nearest the stove were almost too hot to touch with bare skin. The center of the room was warm. Even the perimeter slabs, the thinnest and farthest from the source, had climbed above their usual baseline. She was charging the floor the way Aslak had charged his bake oven in Norway, loading it with surplus heat while she could, banking it for the hours when she could not. At 6, the stovepipe joint slipped. She heard it first, a metallic groan followed by a hiss as smoke escaped through the gap between the pipe sections. The wind outside was pulling at the chimney, creating a downdraft that fought the stove's draw and pushed smoke backward into the cabin. She climbed on the chair and tried to reseat the joint, but the iron was too hot to grip even through rags, and the wind kept shoving the pipe sideways every time she aligned it. Smoke filled the upper third of the cabin within minutes. Her eyes streamed, her lungs burned. She crouched low, where the air was clearer, and made a decision that went against every instinct a person has in a cabin at 30 below in a rising storm. She reduced the fire. If she kept the stove roaring, the smoke would thicken until the air became unbreathable. If she damped the fire down to coals and minimal flame, the draw would weaken, but so would the smoke output. The joint would still leak, but the leak would be survivable. The trade was clear and brutal. breathable air in exchange for less heat. She closed the damper halfway and stopped feeding wood. The fire sank from a roar to a mutter, the smoke thinned enough to breathe at standing height. The stovepipe still leaked at the joint, a thin curl of white that drifted along the ceiling and found the cracks and the chinking, but it was no longer choking. If you're holding your breath right now, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens through this night changes everything. The temperature outside was still falling. She could hear it in the way the cabin spoke, the logs ticking, the chinking crackling, the frost on the window growing audible as ice crystals built on ice crystals. By 8 in the evening, she estimated the outside temperature had dropped past 40 below. By midnight, the sound suggested 50 below, or close to it. She had no thermometer. She had the cabin's voice and 29 years of winters between Norway and Minnesota, 9 of them her own, and the rest carried in her parents' stories. The stove burned low. The fire was not dead. She kept a bed of coals alive, feeding one small stick every hour to maintain the minimum draft that kept the smoke moving upward instead of pooling, but it was producing a fraction of the heat she would normally demand on a night like this. In any other cabin in the settlement, a fire this low at 50 below would mean death by morning. Ragna lay on the bed with every blanket she owned piled on top of her, and Elias's old coat draped over the blankets. She could see her breath. The air temperature in the cabin was falling, degree by degree, as the stove's output dropped below what was needed to maintain the room. But the floor held. The thick slabs around the stove, charged during the 2-hour firing, were releasing their stored heat into the room. The radiation was not dramatic. It was not like standing beside a fire. It was subtle, steady, and low. A warmth that rose from below and kept the air at ankle and knee height, warmer than the air at shoulder height. The center slabs, thinner but numerous, added their share. The room was cooling, but it was cooling slowly, the way a lake cools in autumn, holding its summer warmth against the coming cold, giving it back in fractions rather than all at once. At 2 in the morning, Ragna rose and pressed her palm to the floor beside the stove. Warm, not hot, not even particularly warm, but warm. 6 inches above the surface, the air was cold enough to sting her face. At the floor, the stone still had something to give. She laid her bedding on the slate beside the stove and lay down on the floor. The warmth came up through the wool and into her back and her legs and her feet. She pulled the blankets over her and curled into the heat the stone was releasing, and for the first time since the stovepipe shifted, the shivering stopped. The knock came at 4 in the morning. Marta Bell stood in the doorway with her youngest child, a boy of 3, wrapped in every piece of cloth Marta owned. The boy was not crying. He was past crying. His lips were blue and his eyes were closed, and Marta was holding him against her chest with both arms, and the look on her face was the look of a woman who had run out of options and was now running on something older than options. "Our fire died," Marta said. "The wood was wet. The draft failed. I tried. I could not get it relit. The cabin went cold." Ragna pulled them inside. She stoked the coals, added 2 sticks. She counted them, because every stick was a calculation now, and guided Marta to the floor beside the stove. Marta sat on the warm slate and looked down at the surface with an expression Ragna had never seen on her face before. "The floor is warm," Marta said. "Yes. Your fire is almost out, and the floor is warm. The stone holds the heat from the evening firing. It gives it back slowly." Marta pressed her palm flat against the slate, exactly as Ragna had done 100 times. The boy in her lap shifted and made a sound, not a cry, but a breath with sound in it, the sound of a body beginning to warm. Marta placed him on the slate beside the stove and wrapped the blankets around him, and within minutes his color began to change, the blue retreating from his lips, the skin flushing from gray to pale pink, as the stored warmth of 214 slabs of river slate bled into his small body through wool and cloth and skin. They stayed until dawn. The storm continued outside, the wind screaming across the cutover like something alive and hunting, but inside the cabin the temperature held. It held not because the stove was roaring, the stove was barely alive, a handful of coals and a thin flame that Ragna fed one stick at a time. It held because the floor was doing what Ragna had built it to do. The stone had absorbed hours of heat during the charging fire, and now, 14 hours later, the slabs nearest the stove still held enough residual warmth to keep the space beside the firebox above the threshold where flesh died. Not hot, not comfortable in any normal sense, but warm enough to keep toes, lungs, and sleep, warm enough to keep a 3-year-old boy alive until morning. At dawn, the wind slowed. Ragna opened the damper, rebuilt the fire with the last good wood she dared spend, and reseated the stovepipe joint with a twist of wire she cut from the handle of a broken bucket. The smoke stopped leaking. The stove roared to life, and the floor, the dark and silent floor that had spent 14 hours giving back what it had been given, began to drink the heat again. Marta sat on the warm stone with her son sleeping in her lap and said, "You were right." Ragna did not answer. She was feeding the fire. The storm broke on the morning of the 9th. The wind died first, withdrawing like a hand pulled back from a door, and then the sky cracked open along the southern horizon and spilled a thin, white light across the cutover that made the snow look blue. The temperature was still 30 below. The world was still locked in cold. But the killing pressure had lifted, and for the first time in 2 days, Ragna opened the cabin door and stood in the threshold and breathed air that did not fight her lungs. Marta had left before dawn, carrying the boy on her hip through knee-deep drifts, refusing the offer to stay. She had said 2 words beyond the necessary, "You were right," and then she had gone, and Ragna had not tried to stop her because she understood that Marta needed to return to her own cabin the way a person needs to stand up after a fall. The floor beneath her own feet first. Ragna spent the morning restacking her woodpile and counting what remained. The numbers were bad, but not fatal. She had burned more during the crisis than her rationing plan allowed. The charging fire alone had consumed what she normally spread across 2 days, but the floor had done what she built it to do. During the 14 hours when the stove ran at minimal draw, the cabin had not reached the killing cold. She had survived a 50-below storm on a fraction of the wood any neighbor would have burned, and she had done it with a leaking stovepipe. She fixed the stovepipe that afternoon with a proper wire fastening and a collar of tin cut from an empty lard pail. The joint held, the draft ran clean. She filed the repair away in the same part of her mind where she kept the charcoal marks on the wall. Data, not triumph. Nels Halvorsen came on the 11th. He did not push the door open this time. He knocked. It was a small change, but Ragna noticed it the way she noticed everything now, as information, as a shift in the weight of how people entered her space. She opened the door, and he stood on the threshold with snow on his shoulders, and his scarred hands shoved into his coat pockets. He looked at her. He looked past her at the cabin interior. He stepped inside. The stove was running at its normal morning level, a moderate fire, enough for cooking and baseline warmth. The cabin was comfortable. The floor was dry and solid underfoot. The air smelled of wood smoke and cooked oats, and the clean mineral scent of warm stone. Nels walked to the center of the room and stood still. He looked down at the floor the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for days and has finally come to see with his own eyes. Then he crouched and placed his palm flat against the slate, 3 feet from the stove. Warm. He moved his hand to the edge of the room, near the north wall. Cool, but dry. Not the wet, bone-pulling cold of a dirt floor in January. A clean, neutral surface that was not adding cold to the room. He stood up and walked back to the stove zone and placed his hand on the floor again. The warmth was steady, not radiating from the stove itself, but coming up from the stone, stored from the morning firing and bleeding back at a rate so slow it felt like the floor's own temperature rather than borrowed heat. "How long after you banked the fire?" Nels said. 3 to 4 hours in normal cold. During the storm, with the hard charging fire, the stove-side slabs held warmth for 14 hours. The room was not warm by then, but it was above the line. The line. The line where things die. Nels was quiet for a long time. He stood in her cabin and looked at the floor and the stove and the charcoal marks on the wall where she had tracked time and warmth for weeks. And something in his face did what Ragna had never expected to see it do. It softened. "I told you a house needed wood," Nels said. "I forgot it also needed memory." Ragna did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "How much wood have you burned since November?" She told him. He calculated in his head. She could see him doing it. The same slow, measuring process he applied to everything. And when the number resolved, his eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, which for Nels Halverson was equivalent to open astonishment. "That is less than half what I have burned," he said. "And I have a plank floor and twice your chinking. Your plank floor insulates. It blocks the ground cold. But it does not store heat. When your fire drops, the room cools at the rate the air cools, because the floor gives nothing back. Mine gives back." Nels looked at her as though seeing a person he had not previously recognized standing in the place where a doomed widow had been. He did not say she was right. He said something harder, something that cost him more. "Your husband would not have thought of this." "My father did. Part of it. The rest I worked out because I had no other choice." Nels pulled his hands from his pockets. "Show me which stone works best. I want to look at the riverbed when the ice breaks up in spring." It was not an apology. It was better. It was a man with 23 winters of experience asking an 18-year-old widow to teach him something he did not know. Marta came the next day. She did not bring excuses or explanations for the weeks of doubt. She brought a list. She sat on the floor beside the stove, choosing to sit on the floor, not the chair, which told Ragna everything about what Marta had felt during those hours in the dark, with her son on the warm slate. And she asked questions. Not polite questions, practical questions. The kind of questions a woman asks when she intends to do something and wants to do it correctly the first time. How thick should the stone be near the stove? How far from the firebox does the useful warming reach? How deep should the sand bed be tamped? Does the stone need to be slate specifically, or would any dense flat rock work? How long does it take to lay a section large enough to matter? Can she do it in stages, stove zone first, then expand if it works rather than committing to the whole floor at once? Ragna answered every question with the specificity of someone who had earned each fact through split hands and frozen mornings. Slate was best because it cleaved flat and had the density to hold meaningful heat, but any dark, dense stone that sat flush would work to some degree. Thickness mattered most near the stove, an inch or better. The bed had to be screened, tamped, and checked with a straight edge. And yes, she could start with just the stove zone. A warming field 6 feet by 6 feet around the firebox would make a measurable difference without requiring the full labor of a complete floor. "That is where I would start," Ragna said. "A warming zone, not the whole room, just the place where the stove can charge the stone and the stone can give it back where you sleep and sit." Marta wrote it down on the back of a flower label with a pencil stub. She wrote the measurements, the thickness, the bed depth. She folded the label and put it in her apron pocket and stood up. My husband will say I'm copying the widow's madness, she said. Tell him his son slept on my madness and lived. Marta did not smile, but something in the line of her mouth changed, and she left with the flower label in her pocket and the intention in her walk, and Ragna knew the floor had crossed a boundary. It was no longer hers alone. Over the next 3 weeks, 4 people came to see the floor. The first was a young wife from 2 miles north, whose cabin had a plank floor but whose stove was small and whose wood supply was thin. She wanted to know if stone slabs placed on top of plank flooring near the stove would help. Ragna told her it would help less. The plank insulated the stone from the ground, which meant the stone would absorb heat from the air above rather than conducting into the earth below, but it would still store and release some warmth. A few thick slabs around the stove base would be better than nothing. The second was an older Norwegian man who had heard about the floor through the church gossip network and came to see if it was real or exaggerated. He stood in the cabin for 10 minutes, touched the floor in 6 places, asked 3 questions, and left without giving his opinion. Ragana learned later that he had begun collecting flat stone from his own property before the next Sunday. The third was a pair of brothers, loggers, who came not out of curiosity but because their bunkhouse was miserable and their foreman had docked their wood ration for the 3rd time. They wanted to know the minimum, the smallest, cheapest, fastest version of what Ragna had done that would make a difference in a building they did not own. Ragna told them 4 thick slabs, 2 feet square each, arranged in a square around the stove base. Fire the stove hard in the evening, let the stone charge, bank the fire for the night. The stone would not save them, but it would buy them an extra hour or 2 of tolerable warmth after the fire dropped. The 4th person was Silas Broden, and he did not come to learn. He stood outside her cabin on a January afternoon and did not enter. He looked at the foot traffic in the snow, the paths beaten to her door by visitors who had never walked there before, and his face held the expression of a man watching his inventory depreciate. You're telling people they do not need to buy wood, he said. I am telling people how to use less wood. They still need wood. They need less of it. Less wood means less business. Less business means I cannot extend credit in the spring. If I cannot extend credit, families that depend on me for seed and flour will go without. Those families go without anyway. They go without because the credit terms take their improvements and their claim rights and leave them with nothing. You're not feeding them. You're owning them. Silas's face went still. The words had landed in the place where a man keeps the truths he does not acknowledge, and the impact was visible in the way his jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed. Be careful, Mrs. Tivite. A woman alone in this country needs friends more than she needs a stone floor. He turned and walked back to his horse, and Ragna stood in her doorway and watched him go with the knowledge that she had made an enemy more dangerous than winter. Winter would end. Silas Broden would not. Aslak Moen returned in late January, thinner than before. His cough had worsened, a deep, wet sound that came from the bottom of his chest and left him bent over with his hands on his knees, spitting into the snow. He waved away Ragna's concern with the dismissive gesture of a man who had been coughing for years and considered it beneath discussion. He wanted to see the floor after the storm. He walked the entire surface, crouching at intervals, pressing his palm to the stone, checking the joints for shift. 3 slabs near the door had moved slightly, frost heave from below, working through the sand bed, and he showed Ragna how to lift them, scrape the bed back to level, and reset with fresh ash fill that would compact tighter than the original sand. They worked together that afternoon, the first time they had worked side by side, rather than teacher and student. Aslak mixed a slurry of fine ash and water that he poured into the hairline gaps between slabs, where it dried to a hard, gray fill that sealed the joints against drafts rising from below. He called it pointing, using the Norwegian word first and then translating, and the care he gave to those narrow seams told Ragna something about the man she had not understood before. "You miss it," she said. "The stonework." Aslak did not answer immediately. He smoothed a joint with his thumb and wiped the excess on his trouser leg. "In hard anger, I built walls that will stand for another 200 years. Terrace walls for the farms on the fjord slopes. Every stone chosen, every face dressed, every course level. When I left, those walls were the only thing I made that would outlast me." "Why did you leave?" "Because the farms could not feed everyone. Because my wife's brother had written from Minnesota and said the land was free and the timber was endless. Because I believed him." He coughed again, and the sound was worse this time, rattling and deep. "The timber was endless. The land was free." He did not mention the cold. They worked in silence for a while. The ash slurry dried in the warm air near the stove, and the joints between the slabs became invisible, dark stone meeting dark stone, in a continuous surface that looked in the lamplight like a single piece of rock. "You should teach others," Aslak said. "Not just answer their questions. Go to their cabins. Show them the bed first. Everyone wants to start with the beautiful stone. The stone is nothing without the bed." "You taught me that. And now you know it well enough to teach someone else. That is how a craft lives, not in one floor, in the knowledge that moves from hand to hand." He stood up slowly, pressing his fists against his lower back. His breathing was shallow and effortful. The cough had taken something from him that rest would not return. "I will not come as often," he said. "The walk is longer in deep snow, and the cold settles in my chest now in a way it did not before." "You could stay here. The floor is warm." He looked at her, and in his look was something that might have been gratitude and might have been sorrow and was probably both. "You do not need me here. You need me to have taught you well enough that you do not need me here." And I did. He left in the blue dusk, walking the river path with his shoulders hunched against the cold and his cough trailing behind him like a second set of footprints. Ragna stood in the doorway and watched until he disappeared into the tree line, and the weight that settled into her chest was not grief, not yet, but the premonition of it, the way you can feel a storm in the barometric pressure before the sky changes. She closed the door and stood on the floor Aslak had helped her build, and pressed her palms against her eyes the way she had on the day Elias died. And the dark behind her hands held no colors this time, only the steady warmth of stone rising through the soles of her boots, patient and certain, the way he had taught her to set every slab. The secondary crisis came in February, and it came wearing someone else's face. A family named Gren, husband, wife, 3 children under 8, lived 4 miles east in a cabin that made Ragna's original situation look comfortable. The husband, Torsten Gren, had been hauling timber for the logging company when a load shifted on an ice road and crushed his left leg below the knee. The company teamster dragged him to the bunkhouse and sent word to his wife, Eli, that he would not walk until spring and might not walk at all. The news reached Ragna through Marta, who heard it from the road overseer, who had been asked to help transport Torsten home on a drag sled. The situation was plain. Eli Gren had 3 children, a husband who could not stand, a cabin with a dirt floor and a box stove, and a woodpile that had been cut for a family where the man could split and stack. Torsten could not split. He could not stack. He could barely sit upright without the crushed leg screaming. Ragna did not wait for someone to ask. She loaded the hand sledge with tools, the mason's chisel and hammer Aslak had given her as a parting gift, the cedar rail, a sack of screened ash and sand, and a coil of rope. She walked 4 miles in February cold, dragging the sledge through drifts that reached her thighs in the hollows, and she arrived at the Gren cabin at midday with her face raw from wind and her hands already aching inside the mittens. The cabin was worse than she expected. The dirt floor was not merely wet, it was pooling. Snowmelt from the poorly chinked walls had created standing water near the north side that froze at night and thawed by afternoon into a shallow, stinking lake. The stove was adequate but poorly placed, shoved into a corner where its heat radiated into 2 walls instead of the room. The woodpile, visible through the open door, was a disordered heap of green and dry mixed together, half of it too long for the firebox, and none of it split to a size that would catch quickly. Eli Gren was a small woman with dark circles under her eyes and the posture of someone carrying a weight that had been placed on her shoulders without warning or consent. She looked at Ragna and the sledge and the tools and said, "I cannot pay for anything. I am not selling anything. I'm going to build a warming zone around your stove. It will not fix everything. It will help." A warming zone. A section of flat stone laid on a bed around the stove base. The stone absorbs heat during firing and releases it after the fire drops. It will not replace wood. It will stretch what you have. Eli looked at Torsten, who was propped on the bed with his legs splinted between 2 boards and his face gray with pain. He said nothing. He had stopped speaking 3 days after the accident, according to Marta, and had not resumed. Ragna did not wait for permission. She began. She could not do what she had done in her own cabin. There was no time for a full floor, no supply of pre-selected stone, no weeks of methodical labor. She had to do what she had told the Logger brothers. The minimum. The fastest, smallest version that would make a difference. She cleared a 6-foot square around the stove, scraping the mud down to the hard-packed base beneath. She leveled the base with the sand and ash she had brought, checking with the cedar rail, tamping with the back of the shovel. She sent the 2 older children, a girl of 7 and a boy of 5, to the nearest creek bank with instructions she repeated 3 times. Flat stone, dark stone, as big as you can carry, no round ones, no cracked ones. She drew the shape in the dirt with a stick, flat, dense, the kind that rings when you tap it. The children returned with 8 stones. 3 were usable. Ragna sent them back. They returned with 6 more. 4 were good. She sent them a 3rd time. By late afternoon, she had 14 slabs of varying size and thickness, enough to cover most of the 6-foot square if she fitted them tightly and filled the gaps with ash. She laid the stone in 2 hours. It was not her best work. The bed was thinner than she wanted, the slabs were less uniform, and 2 of them bridged slightly on high points she did not have time to correct. But the surface was solid, flat, and dense, and when she fired the stove hard and waited 30 minutes, the stone was already warming. She showed Eli how to charge the floor, fire the stove hot for 1 hour before evening, let the stone absorb, then bank for the night. She showed her how to feel for the warmth returning. Palm flat, check at the 1 hour mark, the 2 hour mark. She showed her how to place bedding on the warm stone if the fire fell too low, the way she had done during the storm. Eli listened with the intensity of a woman memorizing instructions that she knows will matter when the teacher is gone. Torsten listened from the bed, and though he did not speak, his eyes followed Ragna's hands as she pressed the slabs and checked the level, and something in his silence shifted from absence to attention. If this story reminds you why preparation and practical knowledge matter more than money or luck, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Ragna walked home in the dark. 4 miles through February drifts, alone, with an empty sledge bouncing behind her, and the cold pressing against her face like a hand. She was exhausted in a way that felt different from the exhaustion of building her own floor. That exhaustion had been solitary and desperate. This exhaustion was shared. She had taken the knowledge Aslak had given her and moved it from her hands to someone else's situation, and the act of teaching had changed something in the knowledge itself, had made it larger, more certain, more hers. Aslak had said a craft lives not in one floor, but in the knowledge that moves from hand to hand. She understood now what he meant. The floor in her cabin was a thing she had built. The warming zone in Eli Gren's cabin was something else. It was the beginning of the knowledge moving. 3 days after Ragna laid the warming zone, Silas Broden rode past the Gren cabin and saw smoke rising from the chimney in the thin, steady column that meant a well-managed fire. He had expected to find Eli Gren at his store within the week, begging for credit, signing whatever terms he set. A husband who could not work was a husband who could not pay, and a wife with 3 children and no income was the most reliable credit customer in the settlement. Instead, the cabin was warm. The chimney drew clean. The children were outside, collecting flat stone from the creek bank with the focused energy of children who have been given a task they understand and believe in. Silas rode on without stopping, but Ragna learned later through Marta, who heard it from the road overseer, that Silas had visited 2 other struggling families that week, offering his standard winter credit terms, and that both families had asked him whether stone floors were real and whether Ragna Tveit would help them build one. The question infuriated him, not because it threatened his income, though it did, but because it repositioned him. He was no longer the man people came to when they had no choice. He was the man people came to only after the other option had been considered and found wanting. The hierarchy had shifted, and the woman who had shifted it was 18 years old and owned nothing but a cabin with a stone floor. Silas began telling people that the stone floor was a trick, that it worked only because Ragna's cabin was small and her stove was close to the slabs, and the effect would not scale. That a larger cabin or a family with children would find the stone cold and useless, that the proper response to winter was wood, credit, and community, not river rock and superstition. But the people who had stood on Ragna's floor and felt the warmth under their boots did not believe him. And the people who had not yet visited were now curious, because the loudest denunciation is also the best advertisement. By the end of February, Ragna had received 7 inquiries, some from people she had never met, asking when the river ice would break up and when she could help them find the right stone. Silas was not finished. He was a patient man, and patient men do not lose quietly. But the ground beneath his authority had begun to shift, and Ragna could feel it the way she could feel the warmth in the slate. A slow, steady change that would not reverse itself, moving through the settlement like heat through stone, invisible until you pressed your hand against it and found it already there. In early March, word came through the church that Aslak Moen had not been seen at his cabin in 4 days. A trapper checking his line found the door latched from inside. He called through the window. No answer. He broke the latch and found Aslak in bed, breathing in shallow, wet pulls, his skin the color of candle wax, his chest so full of fluid that each breath sounded like a boot pulling free from mud. Ragna walked the 4 miles downstream and arrived to find 2 neighbormen standing outside the cabin with their hats in their hands and the look of people who have already decided there is nothing to be done. She pushed past them and went inside. Aslak was conscious. His eyes found her, and something in them flickered, not surprise because he had expected her, but acknowledgement, the way a man acknowledges the arrival of someone he has been waiting for without wanting to admit he was waiting. She built up his fire. She heated broth from dried meat and spoon-fed it to him. She packed hot stones from his own fireplace in cloth and laid them along his sides because the irony of a stonemason dying cold in bed was something she refused to allow. The stones warmed him. and his shivering eased, and in the quiet between coughing fits, he spoke. "The floor," he said. "People are copying it." "Yes." "Are they doing the bed right?" "Eli Gren's bed is thin but functional. The others have not started yet. I will teach them in spring." "Teach the bed first. Always the bed first. The stone is what people see. The bed is what makes it work. Everyone wants to skip what is hidden." He coughed for a long time. When the fit passed, his lips were flecked with pink, and Ragna wiped them with a cloth and did not let her face show what that color meant. "You reset what looks almost good enough," Aslak said. "That is the whole craft, not the visible stone, the hidden bed. The patience to pull up what sits nearly right and do it again until it sits exactly right." He slept. Ragna sat beside his bed through the afternoon and into the evening, feeding the fire, warming stones, listening to his breathing deteriorate from shallow to labored to a sound that was barely breathing at all. She did not leave. She stayed through the night, the way you stay when the only thing left to give a person is the knowledge that they are not alone when the heat goes out. Aslak Moen died before dawn on the 6th of March, 1885. The fire was burning. The stones along his sides were warm. His hands, folded on his chest, were still. Ragna sat beside him in the silence that follows the end of a sound you have been listening to for hours, and the world outside was dark and cold and indifferent, and the world inside was warm because she had made it warm, and the distance between those two facts was the entire length of everything Aslak had taught her. Spring came the way it always came in that country, not as a season, but as a negotiation. The cold would retreat for 3 days, and the snow would sag and darken, and water would run in the tracks and pool in the clearings, and then the cold would return for 2 more days and freeze everything solid again, and the cycle would repeat, each warm spell lasting a little longer than the last, until one morning in April the ground was mud, and the river was moving, and the air smelled of wet earth and rot, and the particular green sweetness of birch sap rising. Ragna survived the winter of 1884 to 85 on less than 1 cord of wood. The number was exact because she had counted every piece she burned, marking the wall beside the charcoal temperature notes with a tick for each day's fuel. When Nels Halverson heard the final count, relayed through Marta, who had taken to visiting weekly, he sat in his own cabin with its plank floor and its 6 cords of wood, 4½ of which he had burned, and he did the arithmetic twice because the first time he did not believe it. The stone floor had not performed a miracle. It had performed physics. By absorbing surplus heat during active firing and releasing it over hours after the fire dropped, the slate had extended each firing cycle long enough to let Ragna skip the overnight burns that consumed the largest share of a frontier household's wood. She had fired the stove twice a day instead of maintaining it continuously. She had slept on warm stone instead of feeding a flame. And the difference between those 2 approaches, multiplied across 140 days of winter, was the difference between 1 cord and 4½ The number traveled. It traveled faster than Ragna could walk, carried by Marta and the road overseer and the church gossip network, and the loggers who had laid 4 slabs in their bunkhouse and found even that crude version enough to buy them an extra hour of sleep. By the time the river ice broke up in late April, Ragna had standing requests from 11 households, some within walking distance, some as far as the next township, asking for help selecting stone and laying warming zones. She could not help all of them. She was one person. The river ledge that had supplied her own floor was finite, and the best slabs had already been taken. But the principle did not require her specific ledge or her specific stone. It required flat, dense rock laid on a screen bed with full contact and exposed surface near a heat source. Every creek bank and road cut in the county held stone that could serve. What people needed was not Ragna's stone. They needed Ragna's knowledge. She began teaching in May, when the ground thawed enough to dig and the daylight stretched long enough to work. She did not teach the way Aslak had taught her, one student, one cabin, patient repetition over weeks. She could not afford to. 11 families meant 11 floors, and even partial warming zones took days of selection, hauling, bed preparation, and fitting. She needed to teach people to do the work themselves. She developed a method. She would visit a cabin, assess the stove position and floor condition, and mark the warming zone with charcoal lines on the ground, the 6-foot or 8-foot square that the stove could realistically charge. Then she would walk the nearest stone source with the family and teach them to select, tap test for soundness, check the underside for flatness, reject anything that bridged on a hump. She would demonstrate the bed, screened sand and ash, tamped with the cedar rail in 2 directions, checked and rechecked, and she would lay the first 3 slabs herself, showing the family how contact felt and how wobble felt, and how to tell the difference with their hands and their ears. Then she would leave. She would come back in 3 days to check the work. If the bed was wrong, she would make them pull the slabs and redo it. If the joints were running in continuous seams, she would show them the stagger pattern. If they had covered the stone with a rug or a blanket for comfort, she would remove it and explain why. The stone must stay exposed to absorb heat from the room air and the stove's radiation. A covered stone was a dead stone. It held nothing and gave nothing back. Aslak's voice lived in every correction, the hidden bed, the patience to reset what looks almost right. She heard him every time she crouched beside someone else's floor and pressed the cedar rail across a surface that almost sat flat but did not quite. And she heard him say the words he had said to her in the last week of his life. The stone is what people see. The bed is what makes it work. By midsummer, 7 of the 11 households had functional warming zones. 3 had full floors. 1, the Gren cabin, where Eli had expanded the original emergency zone slab by slab through the spring sasses, had become the second best stone floor in the settlement, and Eli Gren had begun helping her own neighbors select stone, which meant the knowledge had jumped a generation without Ragna being present. Silas Broden watched this from his store porch with the tight-lipped patience of a man who believes that every trend has a reversal point and that his job is to find it. He found it in June when a family named Dahl, newcomers from Wisconsin, eager and gullible, approached him about stone flooring. They had heard about the widow Tvait's method, but had not visited her cabin. They wanted to know if Silas could sell them suitable stone. Silas could not resist. He sold them 4 cartloads of mixed field stone from a farmer's rock pile, round, uneven, fractured, and of wildly varying density, at a price that made the farmer laugh and Silas richer by $9. The Dahls laid the stone themselves, without visiting Ragna, without learning the bed method, without understanding the difference between flat, dense slate and round, porous field stone. They dumped the rock on their dirt floor, shoved the pieces together, and fired the stove expecting warmth. The floor was a disaster. Round stones wobbled and shifted underfoot. The gaps between irregular shapes created channels for cold air rising from the ground. The porous field stone absorbed moisture from the dirt below and sweated it upward, making the floor wetter than the original surface. And because the stones were round rather than flat, their contact with the ground was limited to small points, which meant they absorbed almost no conducted heat and served primarily as cold, damp obstacles that bruised feet and turned ankles. Within 2 weeks, the Dahls tore the stone out and burned extra wood to dry the floor. The story spread through the settlement as proof that the stone floor idea was a fraud, exactly as Silas had intended. Ragna heard about the doll floor from Marta. She walked to the doll cabin the next morning. She did not argue with the doll's experience. She did not tell them Silas had sold them the wrong stone. She brought 3 slabs of proper slate from her own supply, knelt on their ruined floor, and said, "Let me show you the difference." She cleared a 2-foot square. She screened sand from their yard, tamped a bed, checked it with the rail, and laid 3 flat, dense slabs in a tight triangle around the stove leg. She fired the stove. She waited 30 minutes. Then she invited the entire doll family, husband, wife, and 2 children, to press their palms against the slate. Warm, dry, solid, flat. She pointed to the pile of round field stone heaped outside the door. "That is not what I build with. Dense flat stone, level bed, full contact, exposed surface. What you were sold was not a floor, it was a rock pile." The husband, a cautious man who did not enjoy being made a fool, said, "Broden told us any stone would work." "Broden has never laid a stone floor. Broden has never touched a stone floor. Broden sells what he has at the price he sets to people who do not know what they need. That is not advice. That is inventory." The words were quiet, but they carried. The dolls told the Nelsons. The Nelsons told the church. The church told everyone. By the end of June, Silas Broden's stone scheme was common knowledge, and his reputation, already strained by years of predatory credit terms, had cracked along a seam that would not be repaired by charm or pricing. The reckoning came in October, a full year after Ragna had laid her first slab. Silas's mother, Inger Broden, was 81 years old and lived in a back room of the store building. The room had a small stove, plank walls, and a board floor that was adequate in normal cold, but miserable in deep winter. Inger spent January through March wrapped in quilts, complaining of joint pain and cold feet, and Silas spent those months burning double wood to keep her room tolerable. The previous winter's wood bill for Inger's room alone had been $14, a sum Silas resented because it was money flowing outward rather than inward, and because every cord burned for his mother was a cord he could have sold to someone else at winter prices. He came to Ragna on a Tuesday afternoon. He did not ride the black mare. He walked. He stood in her doorway, the same doorway where he had once told her that grief had taken her mind, and he did not look at her face. He looked at the floor. "My mother's room," he said. "The back room of the store, it is 10 by 12, board floor over dirt. The stove is adequate, but the room bleeds heat." Ragna waited. "I want a warming zone, around the stove. Stone, bed, the method you use. Not the whole room, just the stove area." "You want me to build it." "I want you to tell me how. I will do the labor." Ragna looked at him. She looked at the man who had called her mad, who had tried to buy her cabin through debt, who had sold bad stone to discredit her work, who had told the settlement that a woman alone should not pretend to know more than men who had wintered in this country for decades. She looked at him and saw what Aslak would have seen: a man standing in a doorway asking to be taught, and the asking had cost him something he would not recover. "You will need to pull the boards in the stove zone," she said. "Lay the stone on the dirt beneath, with a proper bed. The boards insulate. The stone needs to touch the ground to conduct heat downward during off cycles and pull it back during firing. If you lay stone on top of boards, you lose half the benefit." Silas nodded. "And you will need flat, dense stone, not field stone, not what you sold the dolls. Slate or similar, dark, heavy, flat on the underside, an inch thick minimum. You will need to select it yourself from the river ledge or a road cut, and you will need to carry it yourself, because no one in this settlement is going to haul stone for Silas Broden." He flinched. It was a small flinch, visible only in the tightening of the muscles around his mouth, but it was there. "I will come to the store on Thursday," Ragna said. I will show you the bed method and the first 3 slabs. The rest you do alone. He left without thanking her. She had not expected thanks. She had expected exactly what she received. A man walking away with knowledge he had tried to suppress, carrying it in his body the way stone carries heat, reluctantly, invisibly, and without acknowledgement of the source. On Thursday, she went to the store and knelt on the floor of Inger Broden's room and showed Silas how to screen sand, how to tamp a bed, how to check with a straight edge, and how to seat a slab so the full underside made contact. Inger watched from her chair with the bright, sharp eyes of a woman who had outlived her own expectations and found the view from 81 amusing. He sold bad stone to the dolls, Inger said, as if Silas were not in the room. I know, Ragna said. He knows better now. Ragna pressed the first slab into the bed and checked it with the rail. Flat, solid, full contact. She looked up at Silas, who was watching her hands the way she had once watched Aslak's. Your turn, she said. John Brecka arrived in the settlement in November of 1885, a widower of 34 with a blacksmith's hands and a carpenter's eye and a wagon that held everything he owned, which was not much. He had come from a failing farm in the southern part of the state, looking for timber work and a place where the land had not been plowed into exhaustion. He found a quarter section with a half-built cabin 3 miles from Ragna's place, and he set about finishing it with the focused, unhurried competence of a man who had built before and knew what corners not to cut. Ragna met him because he came to the river ledge looking for stone. She was selecting slabs for Marta's expanded floor. Marta had decided to go from a warming zone to a full surface, a project that required 4 more trips to the ledge, when she heard the tap test sound coming from downstream. Not the hollow, experimental tapping of a beginner, a rhythmic, knowing tap that paused at the right intervals and moved on when the sound was wrong. She walked downstream and found a man she had never seen crouched on the slate ledge with a hammer in one hand and a chisel in the other, dressing the belly of a slab he had already selected. He was trimming the high point on the underside to make the bottom sit flat, exactly the technique Aslak had taught her, and he was doing it with a confidence that meant he had done this before, somewhere else, for someone else's floor. You know stone, Ragna said. John Brecka looked up. He had a broad, weathered face and eyes that held the particular steadiness of a man who spent his days staring into forge fire and measuring angles by sight. My father was a mason in Telemark, he said. I was a blacksmith, but I grew up watching him lay floors and walls. The chisel work I learned before I learned the bellows. Are you building a floor? A hearth zone around the stove in my cabin. I heard about a woman in this settlement who lays stone floors that hold heat. I thought I would try the method on my own place first. You heard about the method, but came to select stone before asking about the technique. John set down the chisel and looked at her with an expression that was not embarrassment but recognition, the same expression Aslak had worn at the riverbank a year ago when he had watched her tap test slabs and seen competence where he expected ignorance. The stone selection I know, he said. The bed method and the heat logic I do not. I was going to ask after I had material worth laying. Ragna almost smiled. It was the first time in a year that someone had approached the problem in the correct order. Materials first, method second, and the correctness of it felt like a handshake between people who spoke the same language. Finish your selection, she said. I'll show you the bed when you have enough stone to start. She did. She went to his half-finished cabin 2 days later and found the floor already excavated and a pile of well-selected slate stacked beside the door. She taught him the bed method, screened sand and ash, tamped in 2 directions, checked with the rail, and he learned it the way a craftsman learns from another craftsman, by doing, not by watching, correcting his own errors before she pointed them out, asking questions only when the answer was not available through his hands. They worked together through November, finishing his hearth zone and then expanding it. He was faster than she had been, his hands were stronger, his stone dressing skill was superior, and he had a blacksmith's understanding of how heat moved through dense material, but he deferred to her on placement and bed depth because she had tested the method through a winter and he had not. The deference was not submission. It was the respect of a person who knows the difference between what they know and what someone else has proven. By December, his cabin had a full stone floor. It was the best floor in the settlement, including Ragna's, because it combined her heat logic with his superior masonry skill, and the result was a surface so tight and flat that water poured on one end would sheet evenly rather than pooling in joints. They married the following spring, in the Lutheran church, with Marta Bell as witness and Nels Halverson standing in the back row looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt. The ceremony was brief. The dinner afterward was held in Ragna's cabin, on the floor she had laid with Aslak's teaching and her own bleeding hands, and the guests sat on warm stone and ate salt pork and beans and raised tin cups to the couple, and nobody mentioned the word grave. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed, and the work that follows is steady rather than desperate. Ragna and John combined their claims. They built a larger cabin with a full slate floor that John laid and Ragna designed, placing the thickest slabs in a radiating pattern from the central stove that maximized the charging zone. They had 3 children, a girl first, then twin boys, and the children grew up on warm stone, learning to crawl on a surface that held the previous night's fire in its dark body. Ragna continued teaching. Each autumn, before the freeze, she would walk the settlement and the surrounding homesteads, helping families select stone, correct failing beds, and expand warming zones into full floors. She charged nothing. She accepted help when offered, a sack of flour, a repaired tool, labor traded for labor, but she never set a price on the knowledge itself because the knowledge was not hers to sell. It was Aslak's and her father's, and now it belonged to anyone whose hands could learn it. By 1890, the settlement had changed in ways visible to any visitor who knew where to look. 14 cabins had full stone floors. Another 20 had warming zones of various sizes. The average winter wood consumption in the settlement had dropped by a figure that no one measured precisely, but that everyone felt in the weight of their wood piles come March. Families that had once burned 5 or 6 cords now burned 3 or 4. Families that had once faced February with empty woodsheds now faced it with reserves. The margin between survival and catastrophe had widened, and the widening had begun with one flat stone beside a box stove in a widow's cabin. Nels Halverson laid his own stone floor in the spring of '87. He was 61 by then, and the work took him twice as long as it would have taken a younger man, but he did it himself, selecting every slab, screening every bed, checking every joint, because he was Nels Halverson and asking for help was something he had given up in approximately 1859. When he finished, he stood in the center of his cabin and said, "To no one. The house has memory now." He said it the way a man says something he has been thinking for 2 years and has only now found the words for. Ragna Tveit Brekka lived out her remaining years in the cabin she and John built on the combined claims near the upper reach of the St. Louis River. She taught stonework into her 60s, walking the settlement roads with a canvas bag of tools and a cedar rail worn smooth from 20 years of bed checking. Her hands never fully healed from the first winter. The scars across both palms stayed white and ridged, but the hands that bore those scars laid more floors than she could count, and the floors outlasted the cabins that held them, and the cabins outlasted the people who built them, and the knowledge outlasted everything. She died in 1917 at the age of 51 and was buried on the ridge beside Elias, and the stone that marked her grave was dark river slate, chosen by her daughter for its flat grain and its clean ring when tapped. On the morning after they put her in the ground, her daughter walked into the cabin and stood on the floor. The stove had been cold since the previous day. The January air outside was 20 below, but the slabs around the stove base, the thick, dark slabs Ragna had laid 32 years before, in the weeks after her first husband died and a storekeeper told the settlement she was paving a grave, still held the faint warmth of the last fire anyone had built in that stove. The heat was not much. A whisper. The memory of a flame, held in stone, bled back into the room 1 degree at a time. Her daughter pressed her bare feet against the dark surface and stood in the warmth that remained, and the floor did what it had always done. It remembered.